Zoom room. Thank you very much. And in case you don't want to be recorded, you're welcome to turn off your camera and mute yourself, and you will not show up on there.
Okay, what do you think, Nikita? We're ready to get started?
I think we're ready to go, and it's nice to know that I've got some fellow Lopesians on the call. Hi, friends. I'm over here at the library, so in case you want to Zoom with me and not just from home. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Okay, terrific. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first in the series for our Climate Action Speaker Series. I'm with the Madrona Institute. We are a nonprofit, and our home base is on San Juan Island. The Madrona Institute really serves 4 areas. We manage the San Juan Island Stewardship Special License Plate, which anyone can purchase if you're interested. Proceeds go to a small grants fund that helps to fund environmental programs in the islands, and really with a focus on climate and with youth education. But we fund many different really great projects in the islands. We also help fund the Coast Salish Youth Stewardship Corps and help to manage that program. We also have the Islands Climate Resilience Program, which the speaker series is part of that program. And we also help facilitate and sponsor the stewardship network of the San Juans. And we have a few of our board members here with us tonight and staff as well. So I just want to quickly introduce them. We have Kelsey, who you can see. She's one of our staff members. We have Erin, who's also Erin helps run the Coast Salish Youth Stewardship Corps, amongst other things. We have Nikita. And Nikita, is there any other board members that you can see on the call?
I believe Janet and Lisa.
We have
Lisa
Janet.
Lawrence.
Excellent. So, and then we also have in the room, we have Sarah Severn and Gretchen Allison. And then I think Ron Z is going to join us. Ron is also on our board. So yeah, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nikita, and she's going to talk a little bit about the Climate Speaker Series.
So hi, everyone. I'm Nikita Palmasani, and I've been happily on the Madrona board for maybe 6 or 7 years at this point. And I also teach for Terra.do. I teach climate change, mainly to mid-career professionals and a really deep dive. And I teach a lot of global fellows. And because of that work, I get to really lean into a lot of the most innovative climate solutions that are happening across the world. And I felt like it was really time to share some of that with our community. And there are so many innovative climate solutions that are happening currently at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, and certainly in our own individual levels. So that's what this speaker series is dedicated to. We called it Climate Action. And in the back of my mind, I think about climate solutions and what are some of the good news things that don't always get shared in mainstream media, where we tend to focus more on what is challenging, and that's important. And it's also good, and I think both hope and resilience inspiring to hear about what are the innovations that are going on currently, how can we support them, and how can we come together to increase both our climate resilience and start moving towards a more sustainable future. With that, I want to hand it over to Chuck Green, who's at the Friday Harbor Labs. Chuck, I'm sorry. I was going to talk about the arc of our sessions. So let me do that really quickly. So tonight we have Joel Cresswell, Department of Ecology, talking at the state level. I'm so excited about his presentation. There was so much news to me and detail around the state's very ambitious emissions reductions and lots of the thick detail, which I really get excited about. So Joel, I'm really excited to have you and your work. Thank you. And the state's work on this. Basically, it's every other week we have our speaker series. So on September 28th as part of Pacific Northwest Climate Week. In case you didn't know that was happening, it's a three city-wide climate week. So it is Portland, it's Seattle, and Vancouver. So as one of those events that's also listed, and feel free to check that out. I'll put that in the chat in just a moment. So on September 28th, it is climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. So Chuck Green will be presenting from the Friday Harbor Labs in removing and storing carbon, seaweed, and algal solutions. Paul Carragino, who's so exciting, also from NOAA, NOAA's Restoration Center, and he'll be talking about local resiliency and adaptations through the federal programs. On October 12th, it'll be San Juan County's climate action plan, but we also got the privilege and honor of having Senator Liz Lovelet introduce that evening. So she'll be there, in addition to Jay Kimball from the San Juan County's Climate Sustainability and Advisory Committee, and Vince DeCunis of Opelco, talking about resilient energy systems and power. And the last night takes it all home. On October 26th, I will be facilitating a networking session with local climate groups. So we'll be doing lightning talks and facilitating networking, really about how do we take our local San Juan County organizations and alliances who are working on climate, and how do we increase our scope and impact by coming together. So that'll be a really fun and exciting, fast moving, and very interactive session to take us home on October 26th. So that is the arc of the speaker series. All that is on the link that Erin just beautifully put into the chat. And now I'll hand it over to Chuck Green. Go ahead, Chuck.
Great. Thank you, Nikita. So Friday Harbor Labs, I'm the Associate Director for Research and Strategic Planning here. And we are really excited about co-sponsoring this series. It's part of
Chuck, I'm sorry, I just want to stop you for a sec. Something's wrong with your screen.
It's showing your
I think you're just in presenter view, and if you go into slide view.
That's fine. That looks okay.
That looks good.
I-
This is
Okay,
all
well,
very tricky. No, that's
So you're all seeing my screen now? Does it look right yet? All right.
Just leave it like that. That's good.
You see it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's going to be problematic though.
While we're working out the tech, I just wanted to bring it to your attention that I put in the chat window about Pacific Northwest Climate Week, when there is so much going on in our bioregion around climate solutions, around ways to engage, lots and lots of different things to look at in there. So I highly recommend, if you get a chance, you can check it out. And in case you want to zoom into other cities in our bioregion, there's a lot of virtual events if you want to be lower carbon. And certainly if you're in multiple cities, there's a lot of events to go to in person as well. So we're excited about Pacific Northwest Climate Week.
That looks great.
All right. All right, fine. That seems to be all PowerPoint wants to do for me. So we are undertaking a new sustainability initiative here at Friday Harbor Labs on our campus. Our target is we want to achieve carbon neutral operations here by 2035, which is pretty ambitious, but we have good ideas about how to get there. We're also planning to reach out to many partners throughout the Salish Sea to enhance the region's coastal climate resilience. And we have a new initiative on developing a Salish Sea coastal climate resilience consortium with FHL serving as its hub. And we're especially excited to get more involved with our local community in developing further climate solutions and resilience efforts. Tonight's talk, I hope you can see this, is Joel Cresswell from the Department of Ecology. We're really excited to have Joel here. Joel's a climate policy expert with a background in environmental science, and his career spans both from public to private to academic sectors. He's spent over a decade in environmental field research with federal positions at the EPA and in Congress, as well as positions in regional and state government in Washington State. And he's currently the climate pollution reduction manager at Washington's Department of Ecology, where he oversees a team of 100 staff who carry out the agency's greenhouse gas mitigation programs. And the programs that he oversees include the Cap and Investment Program, the Clean Fuel Standard Program, the Zero Emissions Vehicles Program, the Hydrofluorocarbon Reduction Program, and the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. So now I'm going to turn the screen to Joel, and hopefully he'll have more luck with his PowerPoint than I've had.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Chuck, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you. I also just wanted to say, by way of a biographical note, that one of my regional government positions was at the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, where I was a colleague of Linda Leishall. So that's Linda was the one who reached out to me to invite me to do this. And I was absolutely thrilled. So anyway, I head up the climate pollution reduction program at the Department of Ecology, and that is our newest environmental program. The agency used to have 10, now we have 11, and that's because we have such a significant amount of climate pollution reduction or greenhouse gas emissions reduction work that it warranted being its own whole organizational unit at the agency level. So we are just under a month old as a program at Ecology, but a lot of our work has been going on for longer than that, just in the air quality program, which is where we were all housed currently. So I'm going to give you an overview of our major climate programs here, and I'm going to start with the biggest, at least in terms of our staffing, and also kind of the projected greenhouse gas emissions reduction input or impact, and that is our Cap and Invest program that was created by the Climate Commitment Act. All right, let's get the arrow keys working. There we go. So at its core, this is a market-based, economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction program. We set a cap on emissions in the state, and that cap declines over time. And within that cap, we then have an allowance budget. We issue allowances. You can think of those as an allowance as a permit to emit 1 ton of greenhouse gases. And then we release fewer of those every year. Covered entities, which are entities that emit 25,000 or more metric tons a year, then have to purchase allowances for their emissions. So previously, you were allowed to emit greenhouse gases for free in Washington, and now we're saying for the largest emitters that you need to buy a permit for that. Now, that said, some entities receive no-cost allowances, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But what is exciting for us is that we auction off these allowances, and we take that revenue and we reinvest that in greenhouse gas reduction and climate resilience programs at the state level. And then also some of that revenue gets consigned over to utilities to help mitigate impacts on consumer bills. So I talked about a declining cap, and this is what that looks like. We have 3 statutory greenhouse gas emission reduction limits coming up in the next 3 decades. By 2030, we have to reduce our emissions 45%. By 2040, we have to reduce 70%, and by 2050, we have to reduce 95% and achieve net zero, which means that the last 5% of emissions have to be offset. And so you can see the sort of blue or teal dotted line declining here is our cap. It's a steeper decline in the earlier compliance periods that we're in right now, and then it will tail off or the slope will get less steep in later years when the reductions get more difficult. But we are still requiring industry to meet these statutory limits that were set by the legislature. So what counts as a covered emission? I talked about how this covers the largest emitters in the state. This is facilities that emit more than 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we just account for all greenhouse gases in carbon dioxide equivalents so that we're comparing apples to apples. This includes gasoline and diesel use. It includes electricity consumed in Washington, regardless of where it's generated, natural gas, and then in the future, it'll include waste to energy facilities. We only have one of those out in Spokane, and railroads. It does not include about 25% of the state's total emissions, and that would be mostly smaller facilities, but also agricultural operations and aviation and marine fuels. So in addition to those allowances that I talked about, emitters can also earn offset credits. And an offset credit is a reduction of a ton of greenhouse gas emissions that is different from buying an allowance. So you can either buy an allowance or you can use an offset credit for a ton of emissions. What's important about the way that we handle offset credits in Washington, and this is new, this is not something that the other cap and invest program in the country, California, does, is if we issue an offset credit, we will cancel out an allowance to issue that credit. So we call our offset credits under the cap, which is to say, you can certainly invest in offset projects. For example, you can invest in forestry or in a livestock emissions reduction project. You can get offset credits for that, but those will reduce the number of allowances that we're going to sell to businesses so that we're not using those offsets to inflate our total emissions cap. And then we also have some strict limits on the use of offset credits. They can only be used for a small percentage of an entity's compliance burden, because although we think offset projects are important, we also need entities to reduce their emissions. So the program launched January 1st of 2023. It was passed into law just 2 years prior to that in 2021. And we are in the process of standing it up. We've had a few auctions already, I'll talk about in a minute. We spend a lot of time doing outreach and assistance to participants. There's a lot of work for the regulated entities in reporting their emissions to us, and then in buying allowances to meet their compliance burden. And then we have a bunch of other kind of administrative processes to bring online. We're bringing on third-party verifiers to make sure that emissions reports are correct, because the amount of emissions somebody reports creates their compliance obligation that they have to pay for. So it's very important that that be accurate. And then we've also put a lot of work into making sure that the exemptions under the program are clear, that entities that are eligible for an exemption, like an agricultural fuel user or a fishing vessel, for example, actually are able to purchase fuel that's exempt, and that everybody who's covered is covered. So let me talk a little bit about our auctions, because I think the amount of money that these auctions are raising that we are reinvesting in climate action is kind of staggering, and something as a state that we're very excited about. So we have had 3 normal auctions so far this year. So the first auction was on February 28th, and that raised just under $300 million. Our second auction was on May 31st. That raised about $550 million. You'll note here it says the revenue is subject to appropriation, and what we mean by that is really the same thing we mean with all state revenue. It is appropriated by the legislature, so we are not spending this revenue, but it's going to the legislature for this reinvestment. Now, our May 31st auction, the price got high enough that it triggered a price containment mechanism that we have. We have some checks and balances built into the system to make sure that it doesn't have too big of an impact on compliance costs, which could be passed on to consumers. And so when the price got above a limit that we set in rule, that triggered an allowance price containment reserve auction, and that's where we release some more emissions allowances onto the market and sell those by increasing the supply. The idea is that that will lower the allowance cost. So we had that first allowance price containment reserve auction on August 9th. That sold out. There were different price tiers in that. What's more important to know is just that it's an auction of extra emissions allowances, sorry. And when I say extra, they're still under our cap. We're not changing our cap. These are just greater than we would have released if we didn't clear a certain price tier. That raised about $62 million. And then we had our third regular auction of the year on August 30th, and that raised about $356 million. That also cleared a price threshold, and so we're going to have another allowance price containment reserve auction on November 8th. Altogether, these auctions have raised about $1.3 billion for the state so far this year. And so this is what happens to the auction proceeds. These are legislatively created accounts. There's the carbon emissions reduction account, there's the climate investment account, and then there's the air quality health disparities improvement account. I will talk a little bit about these later. You know what? Actually, I won't. I'm going to talk a little bit about them now because that next slide got taken out. So the carbon emissions reduction account, sorry, is mostly focused at reducing emissions from transportation. That is our largest source of emissions in Washington. The climate investment account gets invested in a number of projects around climate resilience and other purposes. And then the health disparities improvement account is aimed at improving air quality in communities across the state, especially communities that are impacted by air quality from these large emitters, and then works to improve health disparities from climate pollution in Washington. And we have a requirement, or I should say the legislature put a requirement on itself and on the state to invest a minimum of 35% of auction revenues in overburdened communities with a goal that that be 40%. And then at least 10% of the revenues have to go to projects with tribal support. And we are reporting annually on these investments. I paused for a minute there because we've submitted one report so far, but at that point, no funds had been expended. We'll be submitting another report this year that will have just the few funds that have been expended over the previous fiscal year, and our fiscal years end at the end of June. But the first report that's going to have really significant investments of funds will be next year, reporting on the fiscal year that we're currently in, July 1st of this year through June 30th of next year. And the State Office of Financial Management is also working on a dashboard to track the investments and the emissions reductions that we're getting from them so that everybody can see what we're doing with this revenue. I should also say, if people have burning questions, I'm going to be talking for a little while, so feel free to raise your hand on Zoom. And if I'm not seeing your hand, then maybe one of the moderators can interrupt me. So I'm going to go on now and talk a little bit about market linkage. This is something that was envisioned by the legislature when they created the Cap and Invest program. And in fact, two of the other Cap and Invest programs in North America, the one in California and the one in Quebec, are linked already. The idea here is that rather than each jurisdiction having its own set of allowances and its own auctions, that they issue a combined pool of allowances and have combined auctions. So when markets link, the caps don't get any bigger, but entities in any jurisdiction can buy allowances from a pool that spans all of the jurisdictions. And in this case, all of the jurisdictions is just California and Quebec. We are not linked yet, but Ecology has been directed to explore the possibility of linkage and basically to set up our program in a way that it could link. Now, linkage has to be done by mutual agreement of all of the jurisdictions. And so right now, we're in the process of getting ahead of myself. We're in the process of exploring linkage, ensuring that it will be beneficial to the state, that it won't do things like increase air pollution or have negative impacts on overburdened communities. And we'll be presenting a report to the Director of Ecology at the end of October, at which point she will make a determination of whether Washington wants to affirmatively pursue linkage, at which point we'll start negotiating with the other jurisdictions. We may have to change the law a little bit to make tweaks to make sure our programs are aligned, but we could potentially link by 2025. Now, you might be asking, what's the point of linking these jurisdictions? The main reason for that is that that is the best way to ensure that there is compliance with the caps, but also relatively moderate compliance costs. So compliance costs tend to be higher in jurisdictions that don't link. And when jurisdictions do link, those costs tend to drop. So it's a way for us to achieve the carbon emissions reduction that we're aiming for with a lower overall compliance cost. And that we think, and the legislature thinks, will be better for Washingtonians. So that wraps up what I plan to say about the Cap and Invest program. Again, if people have questions, please interrupt. And I'm going to move on and talk about the Clean Fuel Standard. So the Clean Fuel Standard is our other large market-based program. It's not as big and broad as the Cap and Invest program, which covers 75% of all emissions in the state. But the Clean Fuel Standard targets our largest source of emissions, which I mentioned earlier is transportation. That's almost 40% of our total greenhouse gas emissions here. And this pie is our total greenhouse gas emissions from 2019. The way the Clean Fuel Standard works is that we set a standard, and you can see the standard here. It's in terms of percent reductions in emissions from transportation. And that standard goes down every year, just like the Cap and Invest program. And then we assess the carbon emissions that come from every fuel. And fuel is really broad here. So it's gasoline and diesel, but it's also electricity and electric cars. It's hydrogen, it's biofuels, it's anything that can make a vehicle go. And we assess their emissions over their full life cycle. So if it's gasoline, we'll look all the way back to the oil well and look at the emissions to get the oil out of the ground, ship to the refinery, refine it, get to the gas station, put it in your car and burn it. And with electricity, we'll look at where the electricity was produced and what fuel was used to do that, and the transmission losses to get it to the charger and into your car. So we're assessing all of these fuels, and we'll plot them on this graph. If it's above the standard line in a given year, it's going to generate a deficit. And if it's below the line, it's going to generate a credit. And if you're selling high carbon fuels, you'll accumulate a deficit balance. And at the end of the year, you have to buy credits to cancel out those deficits and zero out your account. And so that creates a financial incentive for the producers of low carbon fuels, as well as the producers of high carbon fuels. The producers of high carbon fuels have an incentive to reduce the carbon emissions to lower their costs, and the low carbon fuel producers receive revenue for lowering their carbon emissions. So these are the fuels that we regulate. Anybody selling these fuels in Washington is required to opt in. And by these, I mean the green chart on the left. I'm sort of circling it with my mouse, but I don't know that you can see that. And then on the right, we have opt-in fuels. And these are fuels that we don't require to participate, but anybody who is producing low carbon versions of these fuels can opt in and generate credits. We also have some exempt fuel uses. These are somewhat similar to the exemptions under the Cap and Invest program. So we exempt aircraft, watercraft, locomotives, and military tactical vehicles. And then through 2027, we also have some exemptions for certain off-road uses. We also have a couple of other ways that you can generate credits in the program. These are kind of interesting. These get at the fact that for some vehicle fueling infrastructure, low carbon fueling infrastructure, there's not a ton of it in place. So that would include electric vehicle fast charging and hydrogen refueling. And so what we do is if you build a fast charger, if you build a hydrogen refueling station and it's not fully utilized, you can get partial credit for simply making that capacity available. And that partial credit will expire over time. And you'll always get more credit for actually dispensing a fuel into a vehicle than you will for having that capacity available. But this is a way to guarantee a return on investment and make sure this infrastructure gets built. We also have advanced crediting. And this is a provision that doesn't actually, it doesn't actually exist in other clean fuels programs in the country. This allows public entities to borrow against future credit generation to fund electric vehicle and vessel purchases. And the reason we have a picture of one of the ferries here is that this is something that the state ferry system is exploring as one mechanism for funding the conversion of their ferries to hybrid electric technology, which is very exciting. We also have some equity provisions built into this. This is to make sure that if this program is to make sure that the benefits of this program are equally shared and the costs are not disproportionately borne by any one community. And so one of those provisions is that electric utilities who end up generating a lot of the credits under this program, because our electricity in Washington is very low carbon and we have a lot of electric vehicles here, they have to invest a minimum of 30% of their revenue in transportation electrification projects within overburdened communities. And then they also have to invest at least 25% of their credit revenue into a list of projects that we in the Department of Transportation control that again have benefits to low income and moderate income customers. And we're going to be tracking all of these investments and reporting out on these and hoping to steer these investments towards what we think are the most impactful uses. So we also have a provision called a backstop aggregator. And I mentioned earlier that we don't require all electric utilities to opt into this program. And so if you're living in a utility district where your utility has not opted in, you might not get the benefits of them participating in the program. So we've contracted with a nonprofit. It's a group out of Portland called Fourth Mobility that's committed to zero emissions transportation and mobility. And they collect all the unclaimed credits that electric utilities don't claim, and they will invest those in transportation electrification and equity. So that is the end of my section on the Clean Fuel Standard. Again, please interrupt with questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to another one of our really exciting programs, and that's the hydrofluorocarbon reduction program. Now, this has a long name, but it's actually a really interesting and important greenhouse gas reduction program. Hydrofluorocarbons were an ozone-friendly replacement to chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which anybody who's been sort of involved in the environmental movement or environmental science for any period of time remembers from a couple decades ago. We learned that CFCs were putting a big hole in the ozone layer. And so we discovered that you could switch to HFCs, which didn't put a hole in the ozone layer. And so that was great until we figured out that they can be up to 15,000 times more impactful, have a global warming potential 15,000 times greater than carbon dioxide. And so in Washington alone, they account for 4 million metric tons of carbon emissions every year. And our total emissions in the state are about 100 million. So 4 million is pretty significant. And it's especially significant given that these are compounds that go into refrigerators or heat pumps or spray foams, but they're not typically intentionally released to the atmosphere. So it's really just leaks of these compounds that are contributing to these 4 million metric tons of emissions. So what are we doing about it? Well, first of all, there's a bit of a mishmash of policies at the federal and state level. There's a lot going on in this graph, but the important thing to know is that this is showing you emissions from hydrofluorocarbons over time, and BAU is business as usual. So this is where we've been in the past and where we will go in the future without any reductions. SNAP is an EPA policy that reduces hydrofluorocarbons, mostly through reining in production of harmful ones. RMP is the refrigerant management program. This I'm going to talk about in a second, but this is a program that we're in the process of standing up that actually requires people that operate large HVAC and refrigeration systems to maintain those, to check for leaks regularly, and when they find leaks to fix them, and when they're replacing their systems to replace them with climate-friendly refrigerants. And so this is sort of the impact of our program. And then if you drop down here to this low green and black line, this adds in another federal program, the AIM Act, which sets quotas on how much of individual hydrofluorocarbons can be manufactured and phases those out over time. When you add everything up, we can get down to pretty low emissions with the combination of federal and state hydrofluorocarbon policies. So we're really excited about that. So I mentioned that we're in the middle of standing up a program. We're actually getting pretty close to the end of our rulemaking process. The hydrofluorocarbon law was another one that passed in 2021. And you can see we are all the way over in late 2023, writing the rules for this refrigerant management program where we're going to be sending inspectors around the state to check out equipment and make sure it's being maintained properly and being replaced when it's at end of life. And we plan to adopt the rule in November or December of this year, and it'll take effect in January. So what we're doing in that rule, aside from establishing the refrigerant management program, is we're also then requiring the hydrofluorocarbons to be collected so that, not only do people have to replace their systems with more climate-friendly refrigerants at end of life, but at end of life, rather than say sending your refrigerator to the dump, and we're actually talking about systems larger than your home refrigerator here. Think about a refrigeration system in a grocery store. But we're saying that at the end of the life, those systems actually have to go to a place that'll recover the hydrofluorocarbons, so those are not emitted to the atmosphere. So now I'm going to switch gears again. And before I go too much further, Nikita, can you tell me how I'm doing on time?
Yeah, absolutely. You're doing great. I think
Okay.
you can keep going.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I want to talk now about our clean vehicles and our heavy duty truck policies. So I referred to these earlier as the zero emission vehicles program, and that's it broadly, but we have a little bit of division by vehicle segments here. So I'll talk a little bit about each of them. So we have a few different rules here. We have the low emission vehicles rule. This covers vehicles that burn gasoline and diesel, and those of us who have lived in Washington for a while remember when you used to have to go to the emissions check program. We don't have that program anymore, mostly because vehicles are made a lot cleaner than they used to be. But anyway, that was the rule that set those standards, and it's still in place and governs the emissions that come out of fossil fueled vehicles. We also have a zero emission vehicles rule in place right now that will put sales limits or sales requirements in effect on manufacturers starting in 2025, and will require that they ramp those up to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035. So from 2025, where we require 8% of new vehicle sales to be zero emission, we're already actually well above that currently. But by 2035, 100% of new passenger car and truck sales in Washington will have to be zero emission. I'll show a graph on that in a minute. And then we also have a rule called Advanced Clean Trucks that does the same thing for medium and heavy duty trucks. Doesn't go to 100%, but it goes up to different percentages by weight class and is going to result in a lot more zero emission trucks and vans in the state. So the 100% zero emission cars and trucks rule by 2035 is shown here. It's called the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. There's a long story as to why we do that, having to do with the fact that we adopt some of these policies from California at the direction of our legislature. And this is something that we're really excited about. Washington is already the second leading state in the country for electric vehicle adoption. And so we're really nicely on track to scale this up in the coming decade and change. And so you can see the sales percentages here. This is a mandate on the manufacturers. So every year the manufacturers will just sell increasing percentages of zero emission vehicles until it gets to be 100. This doesn't touch the used vehicle market. It also doesn't touch vehicles brought in from out of state. This only covers new vehicles sold in Washington. And then we also have another rule called the heavy duty low NOx omnibus rule. And this covers diesel powered heavy trucks. And NOx stands for nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides make smog. They also cause a lot of health problems, especially in near road communities. And so we've adopted a rule, again, from California, directed by our legislature, to reduce NOx emissions from heavy duty trucks 90% by 2027. So again, really significant reductions that we're pretty excited about. So what qualifies as a ZEV, as a zero emission vehicle? Most of the vehicles that we talk about are electric. That's because those are really popular here in Washington. However, there are three different types of vehicles currently that qualify as zero emission, and that's battery electric. We consider plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that have 50 or more miles of all electric range to be zero emission vehicles. Now, an automaker couldn't sell those to meet 100% of their quota, but they can meet a limited percentage of their zero emission vehicle requirement with these high range plug-in hybrid vehicles, and then also hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. All right, so some of the truck policies that I mentioned, so the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, the heavy duty low NOx omnibus rule, and the one-time fleet reporting rule, I will talk about a little bit in the coming slides. So the Advanced Clean Trucks rule I mentioned, this is increasing percentages of zero emission heavy duty vehicles in Washington. This is going to kick in with the 2025 model year. So this will be like that graph I showed you for the passenger cars and trucks. It'll just be for heavy duty trucks, and manufacturers will have to sell an increasing percentage, but we offer early action credits for any zero emission trucks they're selling today. And there are actually zero emission trucks on the road here in Washington. Also, our in-state heavy duty truck manufacturing company, PACCAR, which makes the Kenworth brand and others, they are making a number of different zero emission technologies here in Washington. So that's pretty exciting. So some of the benefits here, large trucks and buses make up a really significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions from on-road vehicles. So they're only 10% of the fleet, but they make up 30% of the emissions and much larger shares of the pollutants that are of concern for health reasons, and that would be particulate matter and nitrogen oxides. And so we expect this rule to reduce 47 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. And you can see the percentages for NOx and particulate matter, and should avoid deaths and hospital visits every year. So again, something we're really excited about in addition to the greenhouse gas impacts. So we also have the heavy duty low NOx omnibus rule. This kicks in 2026 and 2027. And as I mentioned earlier, requires massive reductions in nitrogen oxides and particulate matter from heavy duty trucks that are purchased or brought into the state in those years. This is something that we expect to have really significant impacts on NOx emissions. And again, like the other truck rule, is going to result in fewer deaths, fewer hospital admissions, and just generally improving life in near road communities. And then we also have this one-time fleet reporting rule. This is sort of an addendum to the other ones. It's not actually reducing emissions. What this is doing is we don't actually have data on what all of the heavy duty vehicles in the state are, where they're operated, who operates them, what's their duty cycle, what's the model year, what's the engine year, all of these things that are going to be really useful for us to know as we transition our entire transportation system to zero emissions. So we're actually in the middle of collecting this information right now. Everybody with a fleet of 5 or more vehicles in the state has to report to us, and we're going to be putting together plans once we get this data in and analyze it for how we can bring this segment of the transportation system down to zero. Needless to say, it's these heavy vehicles that move large loads that travel long distances that are going to be the more challenging part of transportation decarbonization, and that's why we need to get good data on them. And so you can see a timeline here. We opened our platform in June. We'll be collecting results through the end of this month, and then we'll plan to release our data and a report in 2024. And that is the end of my zero emission vehicle section and the clean vehicles program. And now I'm going to talk about the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And this, like the fleet reporting, is not actually a greenhouse gas emissions reduction program, but this is how we measure our progress. So I showed you a pie earlier that showed Washington's emissions and how they're divided up among different sectors. That is the result of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So it's our historical record. It's always historical because we can't do it in real time. This is a greenhouse gas accounting exercise that we do looking back a couple of years. It takes us a couple of years to collect and vet the data, but this is our official measure of progress towards our statutory emission limits. So I showed you those limits back when we talked about the Cap and Invest program. Here they are again: 45% by 2030, 70% by 2040, and net zero or 95% by 2050. And if we then superimpose the greenhouse gas emissions inventory on that, you can see how we're doing. And so we clearly have a long way to go. Now, what this graph doesn't show you is that we've actually made really good progress, and that between 1990 and today, our population has grown really significantly. So our emissions per capita have already gone way down. So that's great. We're really excited about that. But unfortunately, that's not enough, because the the climate is not interested in our emissions per capita. For reining in climate change, we actually have to bend the curve down and reduce our absolute emissions. So we have our work cut out for us, but we also have a lot of good policies on the books to do it. So one of the things that our greenhouse gas emissions inventory team does, besides looking at historical emissions, is that they project out our emissions in the future. And so you can see this box plot here. We call this a wedge diagram because our reductions are shown in this colorful wedge up on top. And what the box is showing you is the large gray part is our total statewide emissions. And we're showing those tapering down to the 2030 limit. And then we're showing you different policies here. So this light blue is the Climate Commitment Act, the Cap and Invest program. This yellow here is the Clean Energy Transformation Act. This isn't one of the policies that I talked about, not because it's unimportant, but because it's implemented by the Washington Department of Commerce that has jurisdiction over the energy sector. But that will get really significant emissions reductions. That requires electric utilities to phase out coal by 2035, and then eventually deliver only non-emitting power to Washington. And then we have the Clean Fuel Standard in this kind of brownish orange here. We have a few other programs in dark blue, and then here's our hydrofluorocarbon program in green. And then we have some remaining emissions reductions needed. And so that's just another way of saying that my team's work is not done. We need to work with the legislature to get some additional policies on the books to bring our emissions down to our 2030 limit. And then, of course, as soon as we feel like we are on pace to achieve 2030, we need to start to work on 2040 and 2050. Luckily, I think I'm young enough that I can continue working through 2050. This should be the span of my career. So, maybe we can check back in a decade and see how we're doing. So the greenhouse gas emissions inventory covers greenhouse gases from anthropogenic sources, from human-caused sources in the energy sector, in the industrial processes sector. We sometimes call this RCI, or residential, commercial, and industrial. It covers waste, it covers agriculture. What we are just starting to build out, we released kind of a pilot version of this in our most recent inventory report, is also the natural and working lands inventory. And that's our way of saying basically sort of human-driven releases from the landscape, and those could be certain farming activities, soil carbon loss, or also carbon capture as a result of farming. But then it's also looking at natural events like wildfires, like sources or sinks of carbon in the ocean. This is going to be really important the closer we get to 2050, because net zero is going to mean that our landscape is sequestering the last 5% of emissions that we're not sure we're going to be able to abate from our industries. So what a greenhouse gas emissions inventory isn't, though, is something that goes down to a really granular level that tells you the emissions from every facility, that tells you the emissions today. And so as much as we wish we had all of these things, we wish we could sort of, put this on Google Maps and you could see exactly who was emitting what right up to the moment. That's not a data set that we have yet. That said, we are in the middle of a bunch of improvements to our emissions inventory. The legislature gave us funding to massively scale up our team. So we went from 1 person to 5, which is really exciting. We are in the process of hiring a couple of modelers and a couple of data specialists. Sorry, I keep bumping my mouse. And what we're doing with that is right now we actually rely on a lot of federal data that gets passed down to us from the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency. They are not on the ground here in Washington. They're not tracking Washington industries the way that we are. And so those data don't always best represent our on-the-ground conditions. And so we are rebuilding our inventory from the ground up using data that's collected and produced in-state in the interest of, one, reducing that lag time. Right now, it takes us 3 or 4 years beyond the year we're inventorying to put the numbers out. And part of that is because they don't release the federal data set until every state has their data in. And you can imagine some states are slower than Washington. And then also just to make sure that we are reflecting the impacts of all of these great policies that I've been telling you about. And of course, along with that, we we plan to put a really cool dashboard on our website that just makes our data much more fun and engaging to navigate. So I have been talking to all of you for, according to my PowerPoint here, 38 minutes. And now I want to stop, take a breath, maybe take a drink of water, and hear what questions you have. And maybe I can stop sharing my screen here just so that we can all see each other better.
While you get a drink of water, Joel, I just want to say thank you for that information-packed 38 minutes. And I can already say that there was one specific question in the chat that Janet had, which was, can the collected hydrofluorocarbons be rendered harmless once they get collected?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Janet. So they can be. They can be destroyed. They're carbon-based molecules, and so you can sort of, combust them or otherwise convert them into carbon dioxide, which is, at least has a global warming potential of 1, because global warming potential is always normalized to carbon dioxide. The other thing that happens with them sometimes is that they will get captured and reused. That's something that will phase down over time, but right now there are still lots of legacy systems in place, if we could even call them legacy, because these policies are fairly new, but systems that we are planning to phase out that use substances that we would not allow to be sold new, but people can recapture old hydrofluorocarbons and use them to refill existing systems until those systems can be phased out and replaced. So generally want to make sure that we avoid atmospheric release of those. And yes, so destroying them is one way we can do it. So I see a question in the chat that says, Washington is doing amazing things. You know how other states are doing? Yeah, thanks for that question. I really like this one. We actually work with other states a lot. And in fact, Governor Inslee and a number of my colleagues are going to be out in New York City all next week at New York Climate Week, where they're going to be meeting with a lot of officials from other states, including New York, but also California and Oregon and Colorado and other places to discuss climate policies and collaborate. So we spend a lot of time collaborating with other states, very closely with California and Oregon. I mentioned that a couple of our policies we've actually adopted from California at the direction of our legislature. There's actually an interesting nuance in the Federal Clean Air Act that only California can set vehicle emission standards more stringent than what EPA sets. It was kind of a grandfathering, because California already had motor vehicle emission standards when the Clean Air Act was written. But other states can adopt California standards. That's allowed federally. And so we adopt a lot of California standards. And as a result, we talk to them a lot. But also, they have other programs like the Cap and Invest program and the Clean Fuel Standard that we modeled our programs off of. Now, that said, the advantage of coming second or third is that we have seen how those policies have played out, and we've made improvements on them. And in some cases, we'll make an improvement on a policy in California. We'll go back and modify their policy and make it better. So it's actually this really exciting kind of West Coast competition for who's got the best policy that I think benefits all of us. But it's not just us and California in this virtuous cycle. We work with Oregon in a similar way. Oregon also has pretty advanced climate policies, but then we also spend a lot of time peer mentoring other states that aspire to have policies like ours. So for example, states like New Mexico and Colorado and New York are all really interested in clean fuel standards. And so my staff spend a lot of time talking to them, helping them figure out how to do it. We share software source code for the IT platforms. And so climate is a global problem. All of our states need to take their own action and be responsible for their own emissions, but we are all better off the more states get on board and reduce their emissions, not only because that lowers emissions for everybody and gives us a better climate, but also because it creates economies of scale around the technologies that we need to decarbonize. And so that's going to make them cheaper and more accessible for everybody.
I think we have 2 questions in the chat, and then Chuck has got a hand up. So the next one was, Janet, are you planning to use the data collected by satellites such as methane SAT?
Yeah, methane stat. So thanks for that question, Janet. That's a really interesting data set. And, just in the last 5 years, there are so many cool tools that give us better data and visibility into greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say that's one of the data sets that we're looking at. So that is a real-time emissions data set, and that's not something that we would typically incorporate into a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. But what we can use that for is basically a check on our inventory data. So greenhouse gas emissions inventories are they're accounting. So we look, for example, at all of the carbon-based fuels that come into Washington. And we look at where they go and which ones get exported from the state and which ones get burned in the state. And so it's this very high level top down sort of turn the state into a black box, mathematically speaking, and figure out everything that goes on inside. It's an accounting exercise. But what then we can do with data like the methane stat data set is say, okay, but let's look at methane emissions in the state and see if that matches up with what we're calculating our methane emissions to be. So it's a way that we can kind of ground truth our modeling. So to speak. So it's a really valuable tool, even though it's not directly part of the inventory data set itself.
I think your next question had to do with carbon removal and potentially if any of this revenue being generated, is there any plan for carbon removal?
Yeah. So we touch on carbon removal in our regulatory programs in a couple of different ways. So I mentioned offset projects under the Cap and Invest program, and those are they're not direct air capture of carbon, and they're also not currently really carbon capture and storage per se, but the categories. So let me back up to create a carbon offset credit, you need to have an offset protocol. And there are organizations out there that certify and publish these protocols. And then we have to take a protocol and our staff will examine it and we'll say, yes, this meets Washington standards for an offset. And so the ones that we have now are forestry, urban forestry, actually hydrofluorocarbon reduction, and then also agriculture. And that's mostly capturing methane emissions from livestock manure. And so if you follow one of those protocols, you are, in some cases, like if you're doing forestry, you are capturing and storing carbon. And so we have an accounting method that accounts for, how much of that is actually stored long-term, how much of that might get lost to fires or soil carbon loss or other things. And that gives you kind of a net carbon storage. So in that way, we are accounting for it in that program. We also we allow a certain amount of carbon dioxide removal in the Clean Fuel Standard program. So I mentioned that we look at the life cycle emissions from a fuel, everything from the oil well to your tailpipe. And if you think about the production of a fuel like say a biofuel like ethanol, the most common way ethanol gets made in this country is it's fermented from corn. And so you take your corn and you heat it up and you cook it, and you essentially are distilling Everclear, corn alcohol, and that produces a lot of carbon dioxide. And you could take that carbon dioxide, capture it, and bury it in the ground. There are different ways that people do that, and we would give you credit for that, in that your fuel would have a lower carbon emission associated with its life cycle, because you're doing that carbon capture and storage. So there are a couple of different ways. What we don't currently have in Washington is any kind of a program that says, okay, if you just go suck carbon out of the air and bury it in the ground, we'll give you credit for that. That's not something we currently have, but that's something that we could potentially incorporate into either of those crediting systems in the future.
Great answer, Joel. Thank you. I think Chuck has his hand up, and then there's another question from Irene in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to actually ask the group here if they have questions. Sarah, I'm going to let Sarah, you want to come up here? And...
Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. If you want to just, you can come up or you can. Okay, well, actually, Joel, I have a question for you before this next question, which is, you talked a lot about, the legislature has appropriated the funding and is going to be investing that in carbon reducing solutions. Could you give us some examples of the kind of things they're talking about?
Yeah, it is a really wide range of projects, but one that is near and dear to my heart because I spend a lot of time working on the transportation sector is the Department of Commerce has a $120 million grant program to replace fossil fuel powered heavy duty trucks with zero emission heavy duty trucks. And so they've given out some grants already, and then they're in the process of standing up a longer term grant program where anybody who wants to buy a zero emission heavy duty truck can basically get a voucher that will cover the cost differential between buying a diesel truck and buying a zero emission truck. So that's one small example, but it's a lot of revenue, and so it's a wide range of projects. Some of the funding is going out to capacity building grants to tribes. A lot of these, for example, these carbon offset projects are going to be proposed on tribal lands, and in an effort not to create an administrative burden for the tribes, the legislature created a grant program that would help the tribes hire staff to assess those projects to make sure that those adhere to tribal sovereignty, that those are good sort of carbon reducing projects. There are projects for coastal resilience, so for moving buildings inland, for replacing wetlands where they're needed, things like that. So it's a really wide range of projects, but within those broad categories of there's the carbon emissions reduction account, which is transportation. There's the climate investment account, which is mostly resilience focused. And then there's the air quality health disparities investment account, which is focused on tribes and overburdened communities. So those are the broad categories.
And ferries. We have to say ferries, right? They're going to get
and ferries. Very, very excited about the ferries. I have to say, with our reorganization and the creation of the climate program, I no longer supervise this group, but until recently, I supervised a team of state employees that gave out the funds. They still give out the funds from the Volkswagen settlement, and this was the $140 million that Washington got for Volkswagen's diesel cheating scandal a handful of years ago. And they gave the first and the largest grant to the state ferry system. It was $35 million. And it was to do all the design engineering and some of the construction for the charging arm that's going to be on the ferries. And the first of the Jumbo Mark II ferries is in dry dock right now, starting to be converted. So I don't actually know the end date of that. I don't know if it's next year or a year later, but we have a lot of pride in the ferry electrification, and we are so excited. And I can tell you that I am sure going to try and be on that inaugural ride of the first electric Jumbo Mark II.
Well, we wish it was up here. Do you want to come ask your question? We have another question from audience here.
Hi, Joel. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really clear and compact for everything that you're doing. I know just as a citizen of Washington, I'm really excited for what you're doing, which makes me wonder what kind of, you're very excited and what are the fears? Where are our risks? I mean, I just like kind of realistically, where are the things that really we could get the word out better about to support your program?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about all these policies, and they're having really great impacts in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, but they are not universally popular. So anybody who reads the news has probably seen some of the headlines about the Cap and Invest program. A lot of people feel like that program is having some impacts on consumer costs, and they don't like that, and they maybe don't think that that's the best way to achieve our carbon reduction goals. Or maybe that we shouldn't be reducing our carbon emissions. Of course, we disagree. We actually think it's a pretty efficient way to reduce our emissions, and we think it's important that we societally be willing to pay the costs, and it will cost us money to reduce our carbon emissions, even though it's going to have huge economic benefits for us as we do it as well. So I think one thing is just to advocate for these policies. There are efforts around a ballot measure that would repeal the Climate Commitment Act. So that would get rid of our Cap and Invest program. We, of course, really don't want that to happen. We think Washington needs it. And we also think, even if you're somebody who's opposed to it, it's a little too early to know what its long-term impacts are going to be on consumer costs or anything else. We would like to see our policies succeed. Of course, we don't ever take political positions on things, but in terms of supporting this good work, I think it would just be advocating for allowing these policies to continue and to be successful. And beyond that, I think just letting your officials know that that climate change is important to you, that's a priority. We obviously have a lot of major issues going on in Washington State. I live in Seattle, where homelessness is a big crisis. We have a lot of problems with healthcare. We have challenges with education. These are all really important problems that are worth solving, but we need to make sure that climate remains a priority.
Amen. Absolutely on that one. We have two questions about other kinds of.
Kita, I haven't had my chance yet.
Oh my goodness, Chuck, please get in there. Get in there, Chuck, and then I'll ask you about plastics and concrete. Go on in, Chuck.
Yeah, I was curious why aviation and marine shipping are excluded in the carbon accounting. And then I was wondering how you do include it in the greenhouse gas inventory.
Yeah, so the main reason that those are exempted in the Cap and Invest program and the Clean Fuel Standard is that there's a commonly held understanding that that states can't regulate interstate commerce, and that those are modes of travel that are predominantly interstate, and so that would that could land a constitutional challenge to that authority. But the way that we still account for those emissions in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is we track fuel movements, and so we look at the fuel coming into and going out of the state, and we're able to model the emissions that way. So it's an estimate. Obviously, the whole inventory is an estimate, but that's how we track that.
Great, thank you. Okay, Nikki, take it away.
Okay, there was a question about plastics. Potentiality on reduction of both plastic production and plastic usage, and how it could potentially relate to reducing carbon emissions.
Yeah, definitely. So Ecology has a solid waste program. I lead the climate pollution reduction program. I have a colleague who heads up the solid waste program, and a big part of their mandate is to reduce the production of substances that are hard to recycle and generate solid waste. And so they're doing a lot of interesting work, both on developing new recycling processes, but then also on doing source reduction, on finding out better ways that we can produce materials that give us the same services that plastics give us without being so hard to dispose. So I know that they have provided funding to a handful of companies in the state, for example, that make compostable bioplastics. And some of those companies are actually working on making those bioplastics out of waste products, and really sort of contributing to this concept of a circular economy that, like in ecology, meaning ecology, the scientific concept, nothing is waste, everything is reused. Yeah, and I'm sure they're doing a lot of other cool stuff. And I'm not the best person to talk about it, but yes, definitely the Department of Ecology works on that. And the fact that I know anything about it is testament to the fact that we actually have a saying at Ecology that we are one ecology. It's not very creative, but it just means that we place a high value on cross collaboration. And so I and my staff do talk to people in other programs, including the solid waste program, about the greenhouse gas emissions impacts. Because, for example, if somebody can figure out a way to make plastic out of livestock manure, chances are they're going to be capturing that livestock manure, which is then not going to be emitting methane into the atmosphere. And also, we're not going to be burning a bunch of fossil fuel to make plastic. So that has a clear climate impact. So that's mutually beneficial to our two programs' missions.
Well, anybody who knows my work on Lopez knows that I'm a huge fan of circular economy and zero waste, certainly, and innovations that reduce plastics. And just one key for our local context is that there's a coalition called Plastics Free Salish Sea. So Irene, you might want to check into them because they do some amazing work in our bioregion in San Juan's. Kerm had a great question. There's so many emissions that come from concrete production. And so I know that that's also adjacent to your work, but maybe you could speak a little bit about concrete replacements. And certainly, Kerm, we can have a conversation about that also, and Lopez.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So that's something I know a little bit about, not a ton about. I don't know that I have a lot to say about replacing concrete with limestone, but I will say that actually some of the greenest, in terms of emissions intensity, greenest concrete in the country is made in Seattle. And that's because our electricity in Seattle is very low carbon. Ditto steel, some of the greenest steel in the country is made there. And so, you know, there are still a lot of emissions that come out of making that concrete. Making it with low carbon electricity is probably not the entire solution to the problem of carbon emissions from concrete. And of course, humans consume a lot of concrete. But one thing that we are working on doing as a state, and this is not just ecology, and in fact, the Department of Commerce has a lot of staff working on this, is the notion of taking into account the embodied emissions in products, and just making sure that the concrete that's made in Washington, or really made anywhere with a low carbon footprint, is rewarded for that. So in Europe, if you import a product into Europe that's made elsewhere in a place without an emissions trading scheme, they're going to look at the emissions associated with that product, and they're going to put a tariff on it at the border. So that's one way you do that. Now, we can't do that here in Washington state. That's called the border adjustment tax. But we do have some policies called buy clean, buy fair legislation that require at least state government to purchase products where they are taking into account the life cycle carbon emissions. And those are policies that I think could be expanded out beyond government and help us just make sure that we are rewarding the businesses, especially the ones in Washington, where we have these carbon pricing policies, who are reducing their emissions and making sure that they're able to then derive value from those investments. So I think there is a lot more to be done there. And some of it's probably going to have to be done at a national level. But we're also working on that. And in this case, I mean, the state family, are working on that concept. And I think it's really important.
Sorry about that. Thank you for talking about the scope 2, scope 3 kinds of emissions that happen, and ways to financially incentivize or de-incentivize through tariffs. I think those are great ideas for that. Does anybody have a last question for Joel before we wanted to make just a few announcements, and certainly thank Joel profusely for your time? But if anybody has one more burning question, feel free to either come off mute or raise a hand icon or raise a physical hand.
I don't have a question, but I just really want to thank you, Joel. That was a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. Just chock full of really great information, and very well presented. So thank you so much. And yes, Kelsey has an announcement. Go right ahead, Kelsey.
Hi, I just wanted to do one last announcement. Joel, thank you so much for this lovely presentation. It was so informative and I learned so much. So at the Madrona Institute, as Linda said earlier, we operate the special license plate campaign here in the San Juans, and all of the money to that goes to different stewardship funds, and one of those is a small grants program, and we recently opened up the request for proposals for that program. The grants typically range from $5,000 to $10,000 total, and it focuses on youth education, climate action, environmental justice, and environmental and cultural stewardship. So if you have a topic or a project that you think might fit into that grant fund, please send us a letter of interest and learn more on our website.
Thanks for that, Kelsey. And anybody who doesn't know, and that includes you, Joel, if you wanted, you can get Madrona San Juan Islands license plate. It's a specialty license plate, but all the funds, the proceeds that go from that license plate help fund projects in our bioregion. So here through the Madrona Institute. And yes, thank you for those things in the chat. So thank you so much for that. Does anybody have anything else in closing? No? All right. Well, my friends, this has been an absolute pleasure and an honor. And Joel, again, thank you so much for your time and expertise and all of your work for all of you at Department of Ecology and beyond. And friends who are here, I hope that you will join us on the 28th for our next really exciting topic, which will be adaptation and mitigation with Chuck Green and Paul Caragino, they're both just really fascinating speakers. So hopefully you'll get a chance to join us for that. I look forward to seeing you all again. And thank you for your time.
And
Well,
thank
thanks
you.
so much, everybody, for your attention tonight. It was really great to talk to you all.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah.
And I also want to just thank Chuck and Friday Harbor Labs for hosting the event in person. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks,
Terrific.
everybody. Have a
Hope to
great
see
rest
you
of
in
your
a couple
night.
weeks.
I just
I love it. There's a big round of applause.